Welcome to Security.com, the podcast where we're bringing together in-depth intel, real talk, and the human side of cybersecurity. As always, I'm your host, Dan Mellinger, and each episode I'll be joined by industry experts, defenders, and voices from the front lines to explore the latest enterprise security insights straight from the pages of Security.com and the minds shaping the field. And today we're actually chilling out at RSAC, so the biggest cybersecurity conference in the world. So we're here right outside of Moscone behind us, and we're talking about something super interesting. The Death of SIEM, and that's SIEM, just so we can get it out there earlier. SIEM was supposed to be the nerve center of every security operation. Collect all the logs, correlate everything, surface the threats. Instead, most organizations ended up with an expensive log warehouse that generates more noise than signal. The episode breaks down exactly where and why SIEM model broke and what's replacing it. And I'm today talking with Justin Falck. So he's the head of product for our endpoints here at Symantec and Carbon Black, and he's got some thoughts. So Justin, I guess let's start with kind of what was the original promise of SIEM? Because we know there's the challenge that it was trying to solve. So let's start there.
Yeah, so the original promise of SIEM was really around the idea that you had all these disparate data sources in your environment, security tools, recording data, making, creating alerts, things like that. And they were so disparate that it was difficult to make sense of all of them, to correlate them, to really get to the real insights that were around the threats that were hitting the environment. So with SIEM, the idea was you could dump all your logs, all your alerts, all your events, everything in there, and it would magically correlate all that stuff for you and give you real signal.
Magically being the
key word. Yeah.
The magic part, I think, is where the things failed. So like in the early days, like what was the process, right? Because SIEM, you were supposed to basically take all your tools. They should have some sort of a data feed. You could feed that into the SIEM. And was that a manual process? Did they built in hooks? Like, what was that supposed to look like?
Yeah, so it was supposed to be easy, right? It was supposed to be, hey, you have a feed, you put the feed towards the SIEM would suck the data in and it makes sense of it. What really ended up happening is you ended up having multiple tools with different schemas, different data formats, constantly changing data formats under the hood that a whole team of people would eventually have to manage and maintain and stay on top of in order to make that data work. Yeah. And that's a huge investment for companies, especially smaller companies who don't have the resources and teams. And so over time, what ends up happening is you have all these data feeds, you have all these correlations and things you've built. They become stale, they become broken and brittle, and you spend more time actually maintaining the system than you do actually using the system to find the alerts, the threats, the things that are happening in your environment.
Yeah, because dirty, non-correlated, disorganized data is kind of the challenge that SIEM was supposed to solve as well, right?
It almost makes it worse. Yeah. So the problem that people were facing was they were going to multiple consoles, jumping between contexts and losing that along the way, the threat along the way, right? And SIEM was supposed to solve that. And SIEM just created another problem, another thing I have to manage, another thing I have to maintain. Mm-hmm. And worse is something I have to pay for. Yeah. Typically it's a lot of money because you never know what you need to really find those threats until you're investigating them. And so what customers end up doing is they end up throwing everything in, and most SIEM vendors are volume-based on their pricing. Yeah. And so you end up with a lot of potentially useful but also potentially useless data piling up and costing you a lot of money.
That you're storing.
That's right.
Yeah. So storage costs
it's a mess. It gets bad fast.
Notoriously bad.
Yeah.
Well, and the promise too was, right, the big challenge in cybersecurity is finding, the signal from the noise, right? And that's what SIEM was really designed to do, was pull together all the signals from all your tools, right, and give you an output.
That's the magic alerts. Yeah, the magic correlation that happens. And the reality is it didn't happen. So what you ended up having to do is you had to use really kind of these high-end resources. So typically, folks nowadays call them detection engineers or threat hunters, people with incident response experience would have to go into those SIEMs and actually create the detection logic and actually keep that up to date as new threats were emerging, because the SIEMs themselves don't own the security blades, right? So a SIEM vendor like a Splunk, for example, or QRadar or something like that, they don't actually own the endpoint, the network, the data security, the email security. those are all things that are owned by other vendors.
Yeah.
And so for them to be on the hook to build those magic alerts, they're going to correlate all this stuff was very, very difficult for them to do. And so it ended up falling on the security teams themselves to have to do that work.
Yeah. Well, and they would form basically the core of what I guess a lot of SOCs are, right? They're based around kind of the SIEM as the core interconnecting solution, right? And so you get a lot of pretty pictures and diagrams and things like, in the NASA control room style, right? You think about, but ultimately you're talking about very skilled people with, I guess, previous administration NASA-sized budgets.
That's right. Yeah, small teams just can't do it. You know, they don't have the resources or the skill set, and that's only getting worse. I mean, the talent shortages and things like that are still a thing, and so what ends up happening is you end up with stale alerts, stale correlations, data that's building up and you're paying for that you're not using.
Yeah.
And it just becomes a very difficult challenge.
So
it's played out over and over.
Yeah. I'm talk through, right? You're using this as kind of master control software, and a lot of companies have, right? But what is the challenges in use? Because like a lot of folks, right? SIEM was huge, still is, right? A massive market that's kind of rapidly declining nowadays.
Right. There's a few things that are taken. Yeah.
Yeah, but what was so a lot of people were using it. What is leading to kind of its decline from its popularity, I guess?
Yeah, so the decline is really around the introduction of some other alternatives, right? So two key alternatives have shown up and are turning out to be, they're not panaceas yet, but they're getting there, right? This is XDR and MDR. Mm-hmm. So I'll start with MDR. So for the teams that don't have the resources, so where resource is really the constraint, we're able to now pivot that out to MDR vendors. There's a lot out there. Folks I'm sure are aware of many of them that are out there.
And MDR stands for Managed Detection and Response, by the way. So
Dan.
someone else is doing, your threat alerting, research,
detection engineering, all that stuff. Yep. And so basically what you've done is you've outsourced that out, and they have the resources, the time, the focus. It's their business, right, to build this stuff for you and manage it for you. And so if your problem is really that you don't have the resources, you can outsource to these guys, and they're going to take care of it, take care of it for you. On the other side is XDR, and that's going to be something you hear a lot from a lot of different vendors. We just launched CBX, which is our intro into XDR. There's a lot of different definitions as far as what XDR actually is out there, but really this is the security vendors themselves, not the SIEM vendors, but the security vendors themselves trying to make better use of the data, the correlations, the alerting, and all that, because the security vendors actually own the underlying technology.
Yeah.
So, if I was an endpoint-only vendor in the past, I would be going out and trying to build partnerships with network and email and data security, all that, so that we could build all this stuff together, and we'd probably have to do it in a SIEM. Mm-hmm. But for those vendors that have, a lot of these technologies under the hood, we can natively correlate all that stuff under the hood. We own all the code, right? So we can make tighter correlations. We can maintain data normalization with our schemas and things like that. And so a lot of those operational challenges go away, and you're getting better security signal out.
Interesting. Well, and talking about better security signal, I think one of the challenges you hear a lot with SIEM in use was alert fatigue, right? Like you talk about detection engineering and stuff, but a lot of that was like tuning these systems to not just be more noise.
Right. Yeah. Alert fatigue is huge. It still is an issue. Again, it's another thing that managed detection response MDR is solving for. You don't have resources to go through every alert, so you can outsource it to these guys.
You can rely on smart people to do this a lot to like send you the stuff that really matters.
And with XDR, and one of the big things we're trying to do with CBX is make it so that the signal that comes out is just better from the beginning, right? So the more data points from across your environment that you can correlate together, the more likely you're going to find the things that are truly bad, right? Yeah. So a sensitive data moving from one machine to another may be indicative of something, but it may not be interesting. I mean, 9 times out of 10, that may be a false positive. Mm-hmm. But if I can combine that with something like PowerShell executing encoded commands on that same endpoint, going out to a URL that's uncategorized or just recently set up, now all of a sudden you've got this signal that says that little data move may actually have been part of something bigger, and you can just jump right in and go after it. Yeah.
So it sounds like XDR, right, is security vendor driven, probably more so because now there's more and more security vendors who have consolidated core features under themselves, and then they're doing kind of the correlation, right, versus the SIEMs trying to do it.
Yeah, there are, and there are some XDR vendors out there that are still attempting to do traditional SIEM approach as well. So if you're out there looking at XDR vendors and things like that, you'll notice that some are doing kind of the native correlation approach where, that's what, like I said, what CBX is doing, where we have these technologies under the hood, we're doing native integration and correlation. But there are other vendors that are taking a second pass at SIEM and trying to do it a little bit smarter. The jury's still out on how that will actually pan out, because a lot of the challenges still around data normalization, complexity, correlation, all that still exist if you're going down that big data lake path.
Yeah. Interesting. So it's almost like curating, especially I imagine farther down kind of market, you're relying more and more for your vendors to do this kind of smart integration, versus the SIEM is generally fully kind of custom, right? How does that work?
Yeah, you need the team for the SIEM, right? And if you go down market, you get smaller teams. It's just it's untenable. It's hard to do, right? Either you don't have the budget, you don't have the people, and so they're relying on vendors to do a lot more of that correlation, detection engineering out of the box for them, so that they can make use of the data that comes out.
And so when we're talking about that, it sounds like talent, right, is kind of the crux of everything. Like, you can buy the technology, but if you don't have the teams and people capable of stitching all this stuff together, that seems like really the Achilles heel.
It is really, and that's why MDR has come about, to try to solve some of that for folks. But SIEM, kind of being pushed as a panacea to bring all your data together and everything, in this day and age really ignores the fact that the talent is really the gap, right? It's basically forcing the solution down onto teams that don't have the ability or skill to operationalize it effectively. And it's doubly bad, like I said, because now you've got this team that's overwhelmed because they have to operationalize a SIEM, and then you've got all this data coming in that they don't know, should they use it, should they not use it, do they need it or not, and that's racking up the bills, right? And so that operational bill kind of overhead is it's almost like self-reinforcing, right? It's like the team can't make sense of the data and correlate it fast enough. The data's piling up, you're paying for that data, and then it just compounds, right? And so the industry, I think, is recognizing that, and that's why XDR is coming about and why MDR is really starting to play more of a role. But that's really going to be the solution. SIEM, difficult. It's difficult. It's difficult.
It sounds like
yeah.
Well, that's interesting too, is like, have you seen really good SIEM implementations before?
Most of the SIEM implementations I've seen that are successful are at the largest companies, right? So you're talking big banks, you're talking defense, contractors, you're talking, groups with people who have done offensive work, defensive work, they've done detection engineering, threat, they've got incident responders, and they've really tuned and tweaked this thing. And to be fair to this, after all the stuff we said already, like, if a team is really well organized, has the resources and everything, SIEM can work. I mean, I've seen some great Splunk deployments that not only, bring together security tools and technologies across your security stack, but also things from other parts of your business. So I was at a big financial, back in the day, and, we'd pull in, security data, we'd pull in things from, badge reads and, other kind of physical security and other calendar type stuff and, location-based stuff, and we pull it all together. We were able to really use that to enrich, the alerting that we produced. But we had a team of 30 or 40, and it was all our job, and we were all ex-government people who knew this stuff, right?
So
and we had an infinite budget, basically.
It's the NSA, CIA control room stuff, like for real.
Yeah,
that's a
it worked. It worked.
Yeah.
But if you're if you're down stack and you're more in the mid market and you're a team of couple folks and you're trying to make sense of it, it's like good luck. I mean, that's really, really difficult to do, and I think that's where the industry's kind of having to move to solve for those folks, because shoving SIEM, it just isn't working.
Well, the attacks are moving farther and farther and farther down market, and so before you needed, like, well, only the large enterprises could fully use this stuff, but it seems like EDR was probably the first kind of nail in SIEM's decline, right? Because it takes those use cases and narrows it down, focuses it so it's more attainable for more companies and more teams.
Yeah, and EDR really changed the game also, back, if we go all the way back to 10, 11 years ago when we did this carbon black thing, was the volume of data and the visibility that it provided really kind of changed the perspectives. And that's where, the SIEM budget's really exploded, because then at that point you're like, well, yeah, I've got my preventions. They're going to stop some bad things. The things that really hurt are the things I'm going to miss.
Yeah.
So I need the data.
Yeah.
Okay, what data do I need? Well, I need all of it. It's really hard to choose ahead of time what I can pick. And then you end up with EDR kind of leading the charge into now. Then you have CDR and ITDR and all these other like identity and cloud and data and email and everything else. And people just want that visibility. And so it just compounded, upon itself.
Interesting. So if they're both, because that's an interesting analog, because SIEM, right, the challenge is you're retaining all this data, right? But also, if you're doing detection and response, like you said, it's like a criminal investigation. You don't throw away any evidence at first, right? So you need to keep
you're not
all
dumping those video camera feeds right before you've done the investigation.
So it sounds like EDR, for example. I know at Carbon Black, we were like, we don't know what data you're going to need, so you're going to need to collect it all, right? And so what's the kind of the delta? Like, how is one more data efficient than like SIEM, for example?
That's great. Yeah, so that's one of the things we really focused on with CBX, and some of the other vendors out there, I'm sure, are doing the same thing, where because we own the blades underneath, we can do a lot of optimization.
Blades being like major components of like a technology architecture.
Yeah. So think for us here at Symantec, Carbon Black, we have the endpoint blade, the network blade, the data security blade, those sorts of things, right? Because we own the blades, we can lock in on a schema, and we can be very efficient about how we store data, how we search data, how we index data, how we run our cross correlations, because it's purpose built for the things that we control. SIEM, by its nature, has to, especially Splunk, for example, has to be super generic. And has to be super open, because it can take any data you throw at it. And there's some folks out there, customers you'll talk to, that security is not even the only customer of Splunk, right? They have other parts of their business, finance, accounting, HR, others that actually will dump data into Splunk. And once you introduce that level of complexity of data, you're going to be inefficient. Like you can't optimize, right? And so that's what we've been able to do, because we own the blades under the hood. We've built our infrastructure to be optimized for that data. So
interesting.
We store what we keep. We store it cost effectively. We make optimizations. And we pass that along to customers. Yeah.
So it sounds like kind of the future's moving towards some of these more like curated, I guess, outcomes as functionally, right? You're curating kind of the data feeds that are going in, the important correlations, raising the right alerts, right? So what is kind of replacing SIEM? We've talked about a few things, right? Do you think that's XDR and MDR primarily?
I do think it's XDR primarily. I think that over the next few years, we're going to see more of a stronger definition of what XDR is. There's still, there's the Forrester definition, the Gartner definition, and others, but the definition is still evolving. And eventually we'll get to a point where I think that we'll say, XDR is that native correlation across data sources to produce better signal, for customers. And MDR will always play a role. Because there are those customers that just don't have the staff even to run an XDR on their own. And the more data, the more control points, the functionality we give to the MDRs, the better services they're going to be able to provide. And so if the MDRs themselves can spend less time doing a lot of that detection engineering and management of data and all costs and all that, and they can focus on the alerts and the signal, they're going to provide a better service. So I think XDR is the path, and folks are going to hear all about that more and more. Especially here at RSA, there's lots of that going around. And then looking at those MDR services.
Do you see large enterprises who already have SIEM deployments kind of like moving off of that, or slowly kind of tapering usage? Like, how do you see the future going for SIEM as a class?
The belief I have, based on customer conversations, talking to CISOs, talking to partners, is that SIEM in its current form, as far as like a Splunk, for example, will always be there. And I say that because it does provide other services than just security. So there will be some cases where customers want to correlate with something that we don't have, for example, or they may want to use it for HR data or finance data, whatever I was talking about before. So it may still be there, but our goal is really to reduce the cost and the complexity, right? Because if we can take the cost down, we can store less data, spend less time building those detections, managing that data normalization, the stuff that happens under the hood, those resources are going to be freed up by that customer to go invest in, more security or hire more
Agentic
people.
AI security.
Or or hire
Post-quantum cryptography.
whatever that may be. Yeah, they can
technology is.
Yeah, they'll go chase that down. But we're going to free them up to do that,
Yeah.
right, and better protect their environments.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Was there anything else
This was
in closing?
This was great. Yeah. Just for everybody's awareness, we shipped CBX, or we announced it here at RSA. Recommend checking out the press release, the blogs, and things like that.
Yeah.
We're really excited what we're building here. We got a lot of tech under the hood, here at Broadcom between Symantec and Carbon Black.
Yeah.
And looking forward to see how it hits.
Awesome. Yeah, me too.
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, and that's a wrap for this episode of Security.com, the podcast. So big thanks, Justin. And we'll see you around
Thanks,
the
folks.
show floor. So if you guys are around, hopefully you run into them. You can check out more insights and technical deep dives at Security.com. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share the show with your fellow defenders. So thanks for listening or watching. And remember, stay sharp, stay curious, and stay human.